Hi guys, and welcome once again to Curated Logic, where we try and up your brain game. And supposedly, one of the best ways you can up your brain game is by learning another language. Now, becoming fluent in another language is something I've always wanted. I previously studied Italian and Japanese at school, but to be honest, as a student, I have been notoriously slack. In many cases, people probably didn't realize most of the time that I wasn't working hard, because I gave off the impression like I was. But almost the only time I worked hard was actually really the night before tests or exams. This carried over into uni and other study I've done post high school, and really, it is not until this year that I have understood how much I actually love learning new knowledge. So, I decided to go in hard and give myself the mission of seriously learning French over the next year, a language which I already know a little. Now, there are people out there who suggest that language apps are not the best way to learn a language and become fluent. But for me, as I'm sure it's the same for most of you, it is, I think, a pretty good place to start. But which app do I choose? Although there are a number of apps out there, purely due to hype and recommendations, I pretty quickly whittled the choice down to two apps, Duolingo and Babbel. Duolingo I had used before, very sporadically, but not enough to feel any sort of special connection to the app. So I set myself a challenge. Do both apps on a free trial, up to a similar point, which ended up being about 20% I figure, and see which app, if either, grabs me more than its competitor. And if one does, that's the one I will be paying for and sticking with to the end of its course. So, let's see how I went. So the first place I want to start with both these apps is their design. If you have watched any of my other review videos or have listened to me speak about why I am creating the Curated Logic website, you know how important aesthetics are to me. Although I really am a believer in that the content of an app or a website has to take precedence, because although I can get distracted by pretty things, so shiny, pretty with no substance means very little to me. I in no way think, when it comes to apps and websites, that aesthetics should be simply ignored. So much of the first impression of an app is how it looks. And if it looks like something your uncle mocked up over the weekend to make some money, I'm generally not in for it. Luckily, this is not the case with either of these apps. However, this is not to say that one did not catch my eye more than the other. What I like about the design of Duolingo is the simplicity and the playfulness that comes through the illustrations. As I have been creating more content online, I've realized how much I generally prefer illustration to photography in apps and on websites. Now, this is not because I don't think photography can be amazing. It can be. It is just that unless you have an amazing photographer, I find that photography is more limiting in most cases. People are willing to fall back on very generic photos. Unfortunately, this is what happens in Babbel. The use of bland, aesthetically unconnected photography makes this app feel outdated. It reminds me of the same era of being in primary school and using those first programs on Encarta 95. They were amazing at the time, but a lot has changed since then. This, of course, is a little harsh. There are some good elements to the design and the app works well, but I wanted the learning to feel fun and not like an educational tool from school. But as I said before, aesthetics are not the most important part of an app, especially one from which you are learning something. So, I put my thoughts of design aside and concentrated as much as I could on the actual learning content. I am going to start with a user's first interaction with this content, that being the testing of the user in order to place their skill level appropriately. In this aspect, there was no competition. Duolingo won hands down. In attempting to understand my level of ability in French, Duolingo actually tested this ability. It asked questions in French, both written and verbal, and presented increasingly complex questions. Although I did still end up having to do some lessons above which I felt my understanding was, overall I was pleased with how I was assessed. Babbel, on the other hand, did not test my ability. Rather, it simply asked me to rate my ability basically on a scale of 1 to 3. The levels at which you put yourself are vague and so far apart that I didn't feel like it catered for many different levels of French knowledge. I got placed right at the beginning of the course, as if I knew absolutely nothing. And so, when comparing this to how Duolingo had assessed me, I couldn't help but feel a little underwhelmed. Getting into the main portion of the apps themselves, however, did show that there are issues on both sides of the fence. An aspect of both apps that presents some difficulties is within a very important part of learning a language: hearing the way words and phrases sound. In Duolingo, one of the first issues I came across is the inconsistency with which phrases or words that form a question are repeated verbally by the app. As I progressed, I discovered that there are some particular types of questions for which the app does not offer verbal repetition ever, and others where it repeats the word or phrase every time. This would be okay if it wasn't repeated at times that were unnecessary, but I often found that times I wanted to hear how something sounded was when it wasn't offered. I get that for some, it may be irritating if everything is repeated consistently, but this shouldn't stop the app having the option to repeat anything a user wants. This is especially because sometimes you come across a phrase or a word you haven't yet learnt, and it is not always clear how it should sound. This is in contrast to Babbel, with which I never had this problem. I did, however, run into two other issues with some of the phrases Babbel presented for me to listen to. First, although I was able to hear a phrase every time at the beginning of a question, if I made a mistake and wanted to hear the phrase again, there were times this was impossible. So much of the learning experience is making mistakes and then listening or reading the question again to cement in your mind how and why you made the error. Getting rid of this element in some cases was frustrating, as I always want to understand what I did wrong, so I am less likely to make the mistake again. Secondly, for those who have learnt French or even just know the basics, you know that certain words and their plurals or conjugations sound exactly the same. This is of course something you have to get used to in French, and something that means you have to pay particular attention to the context in order to work out what is actually being said. That being said, there are a few instances where if a word is heard out of context with no other information about it, there is almost no way a beginner can know whether that particular word is pluralized or not. And I just happened to be presented with a question like this in one of the earliest lessons in the course. I was given a question with the word spoken to me being il, I-L-S, meaning they. I was then given a choice of words to use to make up the English translation of this word, in which both il, I-L-S, and il, I-L were presented. I put that I thought it was il, I-L, which is he, but it was the wrong answer because it was they. Looking at that question, I could not help but wonder why, as a very early question in the learning experience, was I, as a beginner, expected to be able to tell the difference between the two words. This further irritated me because it killed off the run of perfect scores I had had until that point. And even if I'm playing by myself, I'm pretty damn competitive. Looking at the writing portion for both apps, there too are a few issues. In both apps, new words are presented at points with no explanation of what they mean. Sometimes this is totally fine, as you can work out the solution through context, but there are other times where it is not so clear. There is also the issue that sometimes it is not the definition of a word that is missing, but how the word works grammatically. This problem appears more in Duolingo than it does in Babbel. Again, sometimes the grammar is obvious and needs no explanation, but sometimes it does, and it isn't explained until many lessons later. Although I think I understand the logic behind this technique, get the user semi-used to words before they are actually taught them, I still feel that more often it was off-putting than helpful. In Duolingo, there is also the issue that when the user is asked to translate something into French, the way the app works, what you have to translate is hidden once you click into the answer box. You wouldn't necessarily think this would be a big issue, but I cannot tell you how many times I forgot whether I was translating the chocolate or a chocolate, the difference between which meant a right or a wrong answer. As for Babbel, the spelling questions were often pointless as they were far too simple. Sometimes a question was literally one letter missing from a word and you had to replace that letter. I cannot see how this would be really challenging for anyone. Babbel also doesn't allow for typos as Duolingo does, and has some question types where if you accidentally make a mistake, you cannot go back and correct it without being docked points. Also, in Babbel, there are some questions where you cannot be wrong at all. It will simply not allow you to enter the wrong solution. I'm assuming the logic is to learn mistakes as you go, as I talked about, but this theory is countered by the fact there are so many other questions in which you aren't completely sure where you went wrong, and you aren't given the chance to review these straight after the round so they stay fresh in your mind. This is where, for my taste, Duolingo does a better job at making your mistakes a learning tool in the general lessons, as you get to give the questions you got wrong a second or third go until you get them correct, without it pointing out what the correct answer is meant to be. That being said, the one place Duolingo doesn't offer explanations for incorrect answers is at checkpoint tests. This is a little disappointing as these tests contain harder questions than those presented in the general levels, and therefore are more likely to be in want of an explanation. The other major part of learning a language to discuss in relation to both apps is the oral portion, that is, you speaking the language. This part I am going to keep short. On both apps, I did not trust that they assessed how well I spoke French at all. There were times when I know my pronunciation was good and the app disagreed, and other times when the most Aussie accent came out of my mouth, parlez-vous français, or I accidentally just slurred my words, je mange, and the app loved it. Consequently, more often than not, I turn the speaking questions off and just repeat the words I am presented within the other questions to myself. The final set of points I want to compare is to do with usability. For me, this includes the flow of the app, the cost, and any extras provided. Both apps provide some pretty good extras. From podcasts and flashcards on Babbel to podcasts and stories on Duolingo, there are enough other components on each app to keep you occupied should you want a break from the general lessons. What I would like from both apps, however, are better and more accessible explanations of verbs, conjugations, and grammar. Sometimes I needed to refresh my mind on something covered in a previous lesson and ended up looking it up on Google rather than wasting my time trying to hunt it down on either app. In my opinion, as much as possible, a user shouldn't have to leave the app for an explanation of what the app is trying to tell you. As for flow, I found the way Duolingo presented the information and in what order more understandable than how it was done in Babbel. Even as I progressed through more levels of Babbel, I kept on feeling like I was jumping all over the place and wasn't being offered a stable learning trajectory as I was in Duolingo. To be honest, I'm not sure how Duolingo made me feel this. All I know is that it did. Added to this was that the levels of Babbel felt too long, almost like 5 levels of Duolingo in one. Like so many people, I do my learning on the run, maybe 5 minutes before having my morning shower or just before I go to bed. With Duolingo, I felt I could squeeze in a level here or there, and this made me want to keep coming back as I never felt committed to more than 5 minutes. With Babbel, it just felt like a commitment to start a level, and there wasn't enough within the lesson that made me excited to make that commitment. As for pricing, both are basically equivalent. At times, discounts will apply, and at times they won't. But generally, to commit to a year like I am going to do, you can expect to pay about $100 US, which is not unreasonable for what either app offers. So in the end, which app did I choose? Well, as you can probably guess from everything I covered, I am sticking with Duolingo. In the end, not only did it have less faults, as I see them, but also offered a sense of fun and entertainment, which I always appreciate when trying to learn. So that's it for today. If you want to continue upping your brain game, you can follow Curated Logic on any of the socials listed below, or you can support us on Patreon, which is also listed below. I hope wherever you guys are in the world, you are keeping safe and happy. Until next time, keep upping your brain game and have fun. See ya.